Well, another Monday is here, and I like to go through my old photos that I had every now and then that I've taken over the years, and I've been taking photos of my work for probably 20 years or more. Actually, the first photos I took that I really got serious about taking was whenever I wrote an article for Motor Age magazine about Power Stroke diesels back in May of 2000, because I had been working on them for 5 or 6 years at the time, and they wanted an article about that. And that was the first article, with May of 2000, was one that I wrote for Motor Age. But here's a few photos and why I took them, and the photo, I can typically remember why I took just about every picture I took. Whenever I look at the picture, you know how you've strummed through your pictures enough that you can remember where they came from and why you took them and all that kind of thing. This one here was a Dodge. There's not only a Dodge cars and Dodge vans for a while. The evaporator drain was set up this way, and I actually got this picture of one that was giving trouble because the floorboard on the passenger side was wet. Now, when you've got wet carpet on the passenger side of the car, or anywhere in the car, one of the things you need to determine is if it's just clear water, like from the evaporator drain, or if it's coolant because of your heater core leaking. Of course, usually if your heater core leaks, you'll smell that when you turn on the, when air is blowing through there. But if it's a wet floor, of course, now here's the other thing. Typically, if it's a water leak for one reason or another, you might remember the one I showed you a while back where one of my students put a hood cable in my dad's Grand Marquis, and when he did everything right except he didn't pop that grommet back in there in the bulkhead, the firewall. And my dad called me as soon as it rained, and he said, I got a floorboard full of water. And it was because that guy didn't put that grommet back in that right. And I got in there and saw that. I knew instantly what had happened because he wasn't having that problem before. And it's a detail that needs to be paid attention to. Well, on this particular one, that little bit of water was trickling down, and it was going, you might see it disappears when it goes inside the vehicle, and it goes down in there and it wets the carpet. It wets underneath the carpet until it soaks up through there. And so they would typically notice that the only time they wind up with a wet floorboard is when they're running the air conditioner. And whenever it's a real humid day, you know, that air conditioner is going to make a lot of water. And so what you're supposed to do to fix that, a lot of these you have to take a cover off before you can even see this, a plastic cover. And you know, the evaporator drains on some of the F-150s back in the late 90s and early 2000, well, like 99, 2000, whatever, that one would drip on the oxygen sensor. And we would have to take Ford had us taking this PCV thing. It was basically a plastic tube that was a closure tube for PCV, and it had a rubber elbow on it, and we were supposed to cut that and stick it on there and aim that water so it wouldn't drop on the oxygen sensor, and then we were supposed to replace the oxygen sensor. But on this particular one, it was wet in the carpet. So what you do on this one here is you smear a lot of silicone around here. I mean, just a lot of it, and that enables that. You know, this is dripping and running back down that pipe like a coffee cup, or like a coffee. You know, when you pour your coffee, sometimes it drips. Anyway, it was doing that, and we had seen this on a few of these Dodges. It was on us. We saw it on a Caravan. We saw it on a Dodge Stratus, if I remember right. We saw it on several of them, and so that was the deal on this. The first one we saw it on, I think, was a Durango that belonged to one of the people that worked at the college. But anyway, now this one right here, this picture you see here, this illustrates, and just about everybody that's done any serious work on a vehicle knows that if you'll put some dye in whatever's leaking, it'll help you find the leak. If you got a black light, you know, they give you these special yellow glasses and all, but you can actually go to Harbor Freight and buy a flashlight that, you know, it's a black light. But anyway, this one here we would use as fluorescent. You buy a kit, you know, that comes with the black light and all that stuff. You can pay a pretty good bit of money for it, but you don't have to pay a lot of money. You can get a black light from somewhere, you know, that you can get pretty cheap. Like I say, Harbor Freight sells a little small flashlight that's a black light style thing. It makes that light up. Anyway, the point is, a lot of times you can see that dye without even the black light, but that's what we had here. This one here pinpointed an oil pressure sending unit that was leaking, and so we had located that one that way. The students benefited greatly from that. You know, I had also mentioned before, some of the people I have known it would take Dr. Scholl's foot spray, you know, that white powder, and just spray everything under there, and then you'd see where the oil was coming from, because it's easy to spot when everything's painted white with that powder. You know, that oil's coming out. It's going to be easy to notice. But anyway, here was an oil leak that was happening on a friend of mine's vehicle. He had a 2.2 liter Camry, and it was leaking from right around here. Now that little piece right here that you're seeing is the oil pump, and there's a O-ring in there that's sort of a triangular shape that you can get. And those O-rings on these Toyotas love to leak. Now the oil pump on this Toyota Camry is driven by the timing belt. So you know, you got to kind of have the timing belt work on a 2.2 liter Camry is real easy anyway. Of course, you know, they went to the 2.4 and it wound up with change, you know, a few years after this. But anyway, this was the first one of these I had ever seen. It was dripping, and it'll fool you because it'll run down here and it'll drip off the oil pan area, and it'll give you the idea that the oil pan gasket's leaking. That's what happened with my son. He was driving one of these vintage vehicles for a while, and him and his family came driving it over, you know, down here from Augusta. And whenever they got here, you can see the pan gasket that was replaced by the shop right before he came. He had a pretty serious oil leak, and so he went and they looked at it and they said, oh yeah, we got to put a pan gasket on there. And so the shop that he took it to charged him $400 to put a pan gasket on it. Well, as he drove over here, he noticed every 100 miles he would have to stop and put a quart of oil in it. I don't know if he just thought to check it or he realized it was leaking. I don't remember how he knew it was going low every 100 miles. But he had to stop and put oil in it. It was just pouring oil from under there. You can see it all over the place. And so this is the oil pump, the same one that I showed you the dial before, and they thought it was coming from here because it was running down here and it was dripping off, and that's that quart gasket they put on there. And there's a little video of us on that same job there, that same vehicle, working the oil pump off there. This little sprocket here, you know, drives the oil pump with a timing belt. And we'll get that off of there in just a minute if we keep watching. And we get the oil pump off of there. There's your little a little O-ring that always gets really hard, you know, and leaks, and that's what was leaking on his. And so we basically had to work that O-ring out of there and pop another one in there. You can buy them. You can buy an oil pump O-ring for a Camry at the parts store. It ain't that hard to come up with one. But anyway, there it was. And so long and the short of it is, that's not a very difficult job. Furthermore, the balancer on one of these 2.2s, you can just pull it off over your fingers once you pull the, you know, the balancer bolt out. So anyway, there's enough of that. This right here was on an old Celerity scope. I bought one of these OTC Celerity scopes. I went in the pawn shop one day over here close to where I live, and I was looking around. You know, I like to go look around the pawn shop and see what people have pawned. And I saw this brand spanking new Celerity scope laying there. It didn't look like it had ever been used. And the guy had, I noticed that the guy had originally started out with a price tag of like $1,000 on it, because it cost $2,500 new. And he moved it closer and closer to the door and kept lowering the price on it, I think hoping somebody would steal it. But anyway, I saw it laying over there, and he had like a $500 price tag on it. And so I says, and see, nobody knew what to do with that, because it was a scope, and people, if it had been a scan tool, somebody probably bought it right offhand. But I said, I'll buy that scope from you for $300. And so he basically conferred with his boss man. He came back and said, $300 it is, plus tax. And so I paid him $300 on the spot and walked out of there with that scope and used it for a long time. But this is me checking the alternator ripple with that scope. That was a bad alternator. After we replaced the alternator, we wound up with this nice little ripple right here. And that little scope was pretty handy. It would do ignition stuff and all that. Now, I will tell you that it was a little bit, I don't know, temperamental. I don't know the best thing I can say about it. And sometimes there were settings that I wanted to change on it to, you know, move the pattern around, set the trigger a different way or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the deal was, but even looking up the paperwork, I mean the user's manual for this thing, because you know, the user's manual had been thrown away by whoever pawned it, I guess. You couldn't really find the kind of instructions you wanted. One of the worst things about having a piece of software or a piece of equipment if the person who designed and built the piece of equipment is the one that writes the operator's manual, you typically don't get very good instructions. They need to let somebody hack their way through and use the stuff and figure out where they ran into stumps, and they need to have somebody else write that if they're going to do it the right way. All right, on to another picture. Just about anybody that's worked on cars very long has seen a GM gas gauge that went completely crazy. Now, I'm not talking about the ones where you got to replace the little servos on the back of the cluster. I've done that too, and that's a lot of fun. I enjoy that. I can do that all day. This one right here is, you know, these little fingers like to wear out where they drag on those. And you can buy just the sending unit part of these things from the Chevrolet dealer. And well, last time I bought one, it was like $145 for just the sender. Sometimes you might want to just go ahead and put a pump in there on general principle. It's got a lot of miles on it. But they use these things for, I don't know, something like 10 years. And this one right here was one that we had replaced because it had worn out and those weren't touching anymore. They changed the design of them a little bit, and they made them longer, and they made them so they were dragging like that instead of having just little fingers touching on the very tip of them like that. And that made it a whole lot better unit. But that's one of those that we changed. If you're going to take a picture of something like this, by the way, it's really important to go ahead and hold it in the sunlight. So sunlight's about the best light you can get on some on some subject matter like this. And I took that picture a pretty good while ago. Now this right here is something I've talked about before. This is almost, of course I will tell you this, and I've said this before, there's shops around here. I could take you to a couple of shops here in town that are working on cars that go all the way back into the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, they work on cars all the way up. And so if somebody is not used to working on a vehicle with a distributor on it, the rules for troubleshooting ignition with a distributor are so different from what we're used to with coil-on plug and coil pack. This burned through rotor right here is a perfect example of the kind of thing that you're going to see on a distributor sometimes. You don't see it very often. Now on the old Chevys, the old HEI, when they first came out, one of the most common failures on HEI was that it would burn through the dadgum rotor, that old big round rotor they had, and it wouldn't start. But on the rotors that are like this, it would start and it would idle, but then when you give it the gas, it would fall on its face and quit. But if you capped off, if you covered up part of the air intake, and you snapped the throttle, it'd rev up just fine, leading you to believe it was a fuel problem. But you'd find a burn-through rotor. And it's easy enough to check for that. You pop the distributor cap and look at it, and see what you see, and all that. So the burn-through rotor syndrome, I had seen that. The first time I saw one of those fall on its face things where you cap off the air was on like a 91 Mercury Tracer. And somebody had put a rotor on there, and they had bought some cheap rotor that you had to assemble in two different pieces and put on there. It was a cheap crummy thing, and I fought with that for a little while. Finally got it figured out. This right here is the incredibly busted up, worn out clutch. What's amazing to me is how long a clutch will still be usable after it's so worn out it should have been replaced 10,000 miles ago. And sometimes people just keep on driving it and do whatever they got to do to make it go. This one here had pretty much been used up and busted the pressure plate. You know, it was really nasty. I don't even remember which vehicle this was, but it was one we did over at the college, you know, when I was over there. Now, every now and then you'll have a situation where you'll have a screwdriver that gets bent when somebody's using it for a pry bar. You know, the snap-on screwdriver say, never use this for a pry bar or a chisel. Who's ever paid any attention to what it says on the handle of a snap-on screwdriver? Unless you're a real stickler for following instructions and keeping the rules, you're going to beat on that screwdriver and use it for a pry bar if you want to. Because I may be telling the snap-on people, this is my screwdriver, I'll treat it the way I want to. Anyway, this screwdriver here was an old cheap Autocraft screwdriver, but it was a pretty thick one, and I managed to bend that thing somehow, or one of my students did. I can't remember how the darn thing got bent. But after it was bent like that, that thing became one of the most useful tools in the toolbox. It was perfectly bent for a pry bar thing. I mean, it was just absolutely beautiful, the way that it just naturally, you know, took on the shape to make it more useful than it ever was as a screwdriver. It was a little miniature pry bar, and I don't know how many times I reached for that thing when I had to have something I wanted to pry out of there. All right, now this one here, everybody has had anything to do with any of these click, click, click noises under the dash on these vehicles. Seen these little, it's like a toy. they got them stupid little plastic gears in there, and those things over time, you know, they'll wear out and bust, you know, all that. And on some of them, you've got to, whenever you replace it depends on if they got a potentiometer in there that's telling the central, you know, the control head where the door is. And on like some of these Chevy pickup trucks, whenever you replace the control head or one of the actuators, you're supposed to let it, you know, give it a minute or so to find everything before you try to use it or whatever. It seemed like, if I remember right, you're supposed to, how'd that work? You're supposed to pull a fuse and put it back in and then turn the key on and wait 60 seconds, or crank the engine and wait 60 seconds before you do anything with the air conditioning, and let the control heads sweep all of the doors back and forth so that it knows what both ends of them are and all that kind of stuff, you know. Anyway, these busted up gears right here, I always love to take those apart. Now this is a kind of a funny story. One time my buddy bought for $3 at a garage sale, he bought a great big old Sony surveillance camera. I don't know where it came from originally, but it was so old that it had one of those great big coax things on it, you know. And so he sold me that for $3, and I hooked it up to a black and white TV, and oh man, this thing made a beautiful picture. And so I told my mother, I said, I'm going to put you a camera up under your carport so you can see who's always knocking on the door. And she had a little black and white TV on their kitchen counter in there, and I put a little A and B switch in there, and I put a little like a power window style rocker switch. I can't remember, I may have used a couple of relays and push buttons, you know, for one way or another. And I took one of these that still had good gears in it and made it so that the only part of it that was hooked up was the electric motor, had 2 wires going to it. And I set it up, I ran wires all the way out of her kitchen, out there around to her garage. She could switch that thing on B, and she'd be looking at that video camera. And because I built this little bracket that had this little motor in the shaft that came out of this actuator, Blendor actuator, came out of an Explorer, I think. Anyway, I had it hooked up so that it would pan the camera back and forth, so that she could actually flip that thing from her TV watching to the B setting, and then she could, no, I remember how I did a toggle switch, one of them 2-sided toggle switches that were spring-loaded to the middle, and she could move that thing, and that picture, that camera would pan around, and it would show her who was out there in the carport and all that kind of thing. I really worked hard on that. I was super, super proud of it because I put it together for almost no money. Paid for a little bit of wire, but I fabricated everything else. And after 3 days of using that camera, the camera went dark. So the work that I did was an absolute waste of time. My dad took that camera down and threw all that stuff away. But anyway, it was something, have you ever done something just you wanted to see if you could do it and make it work? You know, occasionally I'll engineer something like that. All right, this one here is the worst case of a busted radiator hose I've ever seen. That was on a Toyota Camry. That thing just busted wide open, you know. And those little 2.2s are pretty tough. My buddy was driving a 93 model Toyota Camry, and he called me one day and he says, I'm on my way to work over here and I'm at Perry's store, and he says that my vehicle is overheated. And so I went over there, and I mean, it didn't take me very long to get to where he was because he wasn't far from work. And when I drove over there was a crack like you see on these Toyotas all the way across the top of the radiator. That plastic tank had cracked, and he had lost enough coolant. I went ahead, I had some water with me, so I poured it in there. And when we started it up, that thing was puking water out and, you know, making geysers, and like it does when you have a blown head gasket and all that. And I said, it looked like you may have blown a head gasket. We may have to put a head gasket on here. And so he says, okay, well, you know, I've got to do what we got to do. And so we went ahead and I don't remember if we towed it over, if we got a wreck or whatever. Anyway, we had it, took it to the college, and I had it brought into the service bay, and I was going to show the students what a blown head gasket was like. And so I said, all right, we're going to start this thing up, and we're going to show you what a blown head gasket is like. So I started it up, and it warmed up, and the fan came on and off, the thermostat, you know, opened and closed, and it never did any of that water puking business again. You know, I told you about the Bronco I had one time over there that was a trainer vehicle, and it was puking water like that, and it looked like it had a blown head gasket. but it turned out it was a 5.8 that had the 137265448 firing order, and they had wired it up like a 302, which is 154266378, and that's one of the reasons it ran kind of crappy, and it also made it act like it had a blown head gasket. It would heat the water up and punch it out there like a geyser. I got a video of it doing that somewhere, and it never did that anymore after we put the spark plug wires on it the right way, and got it, it ran smooth and everything else. Now, I do remember I detected a bit of a water pump leak, and I poured a little bit of brake fluid in the radiator, and it softens the seal, and it stops the water pump from leaking. It's really amazing to do that. If you have one that's leaking and the seal is not shredded by rust, or if the bearings aren't worn out, if it's just got a leaking seal, and you need to get by, like if you're on a trip or something and it's your car, you can pour just a little bit of brake fluid in the radiator, and you can watch that thing stop leaking. Now, the only problem with that is if you put too much brake fluid in there and you leave it in there, the fluid keeps on getting softer until it's distorted, and then it leaks a whole lot worse. And there was a guy from South Africa that had a Mercedes one time. He's a British guy, I guess, because he even tapped with a British accent. And he said you could rebuild the water pump, or you could buy a water pump, and he didn't have the money because it was like a month's pay for him. I don't guess he made very much money. And so he emailed me through my website when I used to have a website where I would take those questions. And I said, put a little brake fluid in the radiator and you can watch it stop leaking, and then make sure you drain all the coolant out so that it stops leaking. Put everything back in there, and get rid of that brake fluid that you poured in there. And so he sent me back an email the next day and says, well, knock me over with a feather, it stopped leaking. But that's a problem. I mean, that's something I learned at a gas station working in the 70s. In that gas station, we'd pour a little brake fluid in there and you'd see the water pump quit leaking. Furthermore, you can, if you've got one that's just got a little pinhole like a rock has hit it, you can put some black pepper in the radiator, and that'll stop it from leaking long enough to where you can get something done with it, And so there's all kinds of on-the-road tricks you can do. Some people say they'd break an egg and put it in the radiator, and whenever it started cooking, it would get down in there and clog up whatever hole it was leaking in the radiator. But also, you remember the Xerox antifreeze commercial? They used to have a Xerox. Look this up on YouTube. There's a Xerox antifreeze commercial where the antifreeze was in a steel can, and they would be poking holes in it with a pick. They'd start at the bottom and they'd poke a hole, and it would start leaking and quit. They go higher up on the can and poke a hole and start leaking and quit. And they must have poked half a dozen holes in that Xerox antifreeze can, and it would stop leaking. It came with some kind of stop leak in it. And I don't know, I don't think Xerox does that anymore, but that was their claim to fame for a while. But here's the good old days. You probably remember the old, these old motors like this. Now this one here was at a car show. At our church one time, the pastor said we were going to have a car show, and the little church I go to's got about 80 people in the congregation. I thought, why's going to come to a car show? Here's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Well, I tell you what, when it came day for that car show, there was a big outfit. I mean, there's old cars all over the place like you wouldn't believe. They had an old snow cone stand that was made out of the back part of an old Mustang with a veranda. I couldn't believe what an incredibly massive car show that all these people showed. Anyway, this was a picture I took at that car show. Now this one here had an MSD ignition module over on the side, but it's got an upgraded air conditioner compressor. You might notice that somebody has put on there. But these are beautiful old cars. I love those old cars like that. And they went out of their way to make sure it looked as factory as they possibly could, And this stuff right here, if you're a hobby kind of a person, and somebody wants to fix up an old car, it's a labor of love to do this work yourself. If you hire somebody to do it, you're going to have $30,000 in a $15,000 car. It's not a good idea. Something else you can do, and I learned this a long time ago, back in 1977, I was working at a shop over here, and this guy brought a 66 Thunderbird in there, and he wanted to put an engine in it. He had like $1,500 worth of money that he spent. Let's see. He said he had $1,500 set aside to restore that car, and the first thing he wanted was the engine put in there. I don't remember how much it cost. I think back in those days, putting an engine in that car cost $600 or something like that. And a lot of people have the idea that when you replace the engine in a car, it's like a new car, but that's just not the way it is. There's a whole lot of other stuff to a car besides the engine. Furthermore, the guy that I was about 20 years old in 1977, and this other guy that worked there was 26, and he was telling me, he says, you can spend $600 on an old car like this and have a $200 car once you've put a motor in it. So just because you put a $1,500 motor in a car doesn't mean you still don't have a $300 car. And my father-in-law had an old 78 Ford one-ton truck with a heavy-duty sport-speed transmission, a straight six motor in it, and he was getting ready to get rid of it back in the 90s. And he told me, he said, what do you suppose I could get for this truck? And I said, well, if you sell the truck running, you're probably going to be able to get about $300 out of it. If you pull the transmission out and sell just the transmission, somebody will give you $500 for that transmission if they need a transmission, you know. And so that's just the way it is, you know. The people will pay more for an engine than they will a truck with an engine in it, you know, for some strange reason, you know. Anyway, this is the look that you have when the vehicle you worked on comes in on the hook. The one you worked on yesterday comes in on the hook. You know, you got this, you know, look on that. I don't know if anybody's ever experienced that. Somebody that says they've never had a repeat repair or a comeback, you know, is either absolutely perfect or they're just not telling the truth. Everybody's had them come in on the hook when they could have sworn they fixed it right, you know. This right here is a good thing to have. I had this bucket with all these connectors in it. Every time I had to replace a wire harness or had a chance to, you know, get my hands on a little wire harness that was being thrown away, I'd cut the connectors off and put them in a bucket. And I had that bucket. I left the dealership with it and took it to the college. And after I left the college, I left it there because I just didn't need it here at the house anymore. But there was a guy that came in one time, and back in the late 80s, Ford was putting some really neat little amplifiers under the back package tray, and they would, you know, have your radio talking to the speakers through the amplifier. Somebody got in there and stole this guy's amplifier and cut the wires off the doggone wire harness. And it was a peculiar type connector that he needed, and he went to the parts room. And if you go to the parts room, fellas, I really don't know how it is now, but back in the day, if you went to the parts room looking for a connector, you might very well find out that they're trying to sell you a whole wire harness when you could have bought just a connector. Now, you've probably seen these Delco and Motorcraft flip charts that actually have the little connector pigtails. And you can say, here's the connector pigtail I need for the power window switch in my 99 GMC, and it's exactly the right one, made by Delco. And you can go ahead and buy it. They may want $90 for that one connector, but there are places where you can get connectors. And I used to get ill with the people in the parts room because they didn't want to go to the trouble to look up the connector. They would just want to sell you a whole harness because that was easier, you know. And then, and of course, a whole harness would be very expensive. Of course, a lot of the times you can't get a harness nowadays. I know for an absolute fact that my friend had I told this story one time before, a 2006 Impala. He could not find a wire harness for that thing, or it might have been a 2008. Anyway, the guy that owned it had bypassed a fuse using a piece of Romex wire because he was wanting the air conditioner to keep working instead of the compressor clutch blowing the fuse. And he cooked the wires and just melted the harness. You know how it wires things together all throughout the harness, and you got to split the whole harness and work on it for a whole day, get it straightened out. Well, there was no wire harness available, and it was either, you know, junk the car, pay somebody for 8 hours worth of labor to split the harness, or the guy could fix it himself. Anyway, that guy wound up in a mess because he didn't realize what a fuse was for. Anyway, this was my Jeep, yellow Jeep Cherokee, the 4-liter that was in that one. I would drive that thing all the way from where I worked to the town where I live, which is about 30 miles. And I would park at Winn-Dixie, and I would go in there to buy some bananas. And then when I came out, whenever it would fire up, it would skip on cylinder number 3 for a little bit, and then it would clear up. And it did this for a long time before I ever did anything about it. And finally, whenever I pull number 3 is the one that likes to breach on these, and you can see if you look right there where that thing was leaking past that fire ring. You know, the water was coming here and going into the cylinder, and you can also see that green stuff crusted up on top of the piston, which is the residual results of antifreeze getting in there. Anyway, I took this cylinder head to Pilcher's machine shop over here. Incidentally, somewhere I got a picture of an engine I took pictures of. Pilcher's machine shop is one of the most astonishing places I've ever seen, because when you go in there, he's got these big, super powered, polished, incredibly expensive looking engines he's building from scratch. And then, or you'll go in there, he's working on a big funny car with the big wheels on it that are about 3 feet in diameter and all that kind of stuff. And when you go in there 2 or 3 days later, he's got a whole bunch of different stuff in there. So he runs a lot of stuff through there. That's a totally amazing place, you know. I think he calls it Pilcher Automotives, you know, but he's been around for a long time in this area, and he's got an amazing machine shop. Whenever he bores an engine, for example, a lot of them, whenever they bore an engine out, like to bore the cylinders on an engine, on an older engine, they use a machine that bolts to the deck and bores it that way. His machine actually centers that bore on the crankshaft. In other words, the crankshaft center, you know, where the main bearing is, he goes straight down through the middle of it instead of using the flat part of the top of the deck to determine, you know, the straightness of the bore. He actually does it a different way and centers it up on the center of the crankshaft. It's a strange kind of a way he does that, but he builds some incredibly high-powered engines for boats and all kinds of stuff, and he gets special valve covers made somewhere in California, shipped over here. I'm going to show you a picture of that sooner or later. It says Pilcher Automotive on the valve cover. And the guy likes to talk too. You go in there and start talking to him, he'll just talk and talk and talk. Well, I would take a head over there for him to rework, and look up Pilcher Automotive on the internet. You'll probably find it and see pictures of his stuff. And he basically says, bring me the valve stem seals in the head. And what he does when he does the valve job on the head, he also takes the thing and puts it in his cylinder head resurfacing machine, and he makes a very, very, very light cut on it so that that thing looks like a brand spanking new cylinder head when you get it back, and he wraps it in plastic. And so he does some of the best work I've ever seen, and his prices are really reasonable too as far as doing, you know, cylinder head work. But he redid the cylinder head on his Jeep Cherokee that I had, and it took care of this problem where it would start skipping like that. This right here is an ignition coil from a 96 model Mazda 626 that we worked on. It was sputtering and popping and cutting up. That guy dug that thing out of the barn. I think I may have made a video on that, but I don't remember. We had to do a bunch of work on it, and every time you turned around, there's something else, some other crazy something going wrong with that car. But anyway, this coil, you know, went south and all that. And what I used to like to do was take my, you know, on one of these cars that had the coil built into the distributor, I would like to take it off, and I'd find the wires that cooked to the coil that fired the coil, and I'd take my test light and hook it to the, and I'd see if it was getting a pulse, and if it was getting a pulse but the coil wasn't firing, well, you got a coil problem. You know, I wasn't too difficult there. If it's not getting a pulse, then the trouble's somewhere else. But anyway, whenever water is getting into the cylinder, you're going to see a spark plug that looks like this if it's been getting in there a long time. People will drive them for a long time. They may not even be overheating. They may just be getting water in there and wetting the plug and skipping a little bit when they first start it, and then when they drive off, you know, it clears up, and as long as it clears up, if it ain't broke, they don't fix it. And so over a long period of time, you wind up getting a really, really rusty, ugly looking plug like this when it ought to be looking like that. You'll see it looking like that because of all that water getting in there and oxidizing and attacking that plug. This right here is another picture I took at that car show we had at our church. This was an old Corvair. This was the first engine that used a PCV valve, the Corvair engine. I think it was in 62 or 63 when they did that. But the PCV valve is right here on that engine. Before that, all the engines just had a draft tube, and when you drive down the road, it would have a draft tube, but you cut at an angle so that the air would go past the draft tube, and it would pull the crankcase pressure out of there, and it would drip on the pavement and stink up the air and all that kind of stuff. You know, a lot of the emission controls that we have are really, really necessary. The policemen in these big cities that had to do traffic, you know, direct traffic, their eyes would burn, and it was just smog everywhere and all that. It's really a good idea that we got a lot of these emission control. Old timers didn't like it, but you know, it's a good thing that we did that. Identify this engine. Anybody know what this engine is? Have you seen one of these before? If you've ever looked under the hood, and this is not what this engine came from, but if you've ever looked under the hood of an Eagle Premier, you'll recognize an engine that looks almost exactly like this, although that's a 3-liter and this is a 2.8. This particular engine here that you're seeing, this exploded view of this engine, you know, the old Eagle Premier was an Americanized R25 Renault, or Renault if you want to say it that way, and they all had this engine in them. This one here was in a Delorean. Now, one day when I was at the dealership, I walked by the general manager of the dealer principal's office, and I saw this car sitting out there outside his office. and he had an outside entrance to his office, and I stepped in and I says, "What's going on with this Delorean you got sitting out here?" He said, "Well, this guy's had it in his garage for a lot of years. He only it's only got 8,000 miles on it." He says, and he wanted to trade it to me for a new Ford pickup. And he said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." And I said, "Well, you probably ought to trade him out of it, because these DeLoreans, they only made about 8,000 of them. They're really hard to come by. And if there's one with 8,000 miles on it, that might be a good investment." And so he went ahead and traded that guy a pickup for this DeLorean and put it in the showroom. Kept it in there for a long time. And he didn't drive it very much. He just put it in the showroom for people to go ooh and ah about, because how often do you see a DeLorean anyway? Well, my buddy decided he was going to buy it from him, and I don't remember what he paid him for it. He paid him a pretty good bit for it, but I don't know, maybe $10,000, $8,000, something like that. I don't know what he paid for it. To tell you the truth, it ain't really none of my business or anybody else's. But the point is, it didn't run right. It would cut up, and now these had that K-Jetronic fuel injection on it, like some of the Volkswagen Rabbits had, mechanical fuel injection, had the braided lines and the little poppets as you snap into the O-rings down there. And this one here, it turned out that the problem with this one, why it wasn't running right, was it seemed to me like the fuel line coming out of the fuel tank had deteriorated on the inside. It had just about closed up. And so all he really had to do to make the car run like it was supposed to, was replace a piece of fuel hose. It was either the return line going back into the tank or the line coming out of the tank. I don't remember which one it was, but that's what was wrong with the vehicle. Well, until next time, I appreciate you guys stopping in and listening to me ramble for a while, and I hope you enjoy the video. So give me a like, make a comment, and I'll see you next time.